The sun had barely crested the mesa when the challenge echoed across Dry Creek Valley like thunder before a storm. Word spread faster than wildfire through sagebrush. A widow with fire in her eyes and steel in her voice had thrown down the gauntlet that would separate the wheat from the chaff, the cowboys from the pretenders, the men from the boys. Her name was Catherine Sterling, and she owned the finest piece of horseflesh this side of the Rio Grande. A black stallion named Tempest, 17 hands high, with eyes like coal and a spirit that had never been broken. Not by the 25 men who'd tried, not by the silver-tongued horsebreakers who'd come from as far as Kansas City with their ropes and their boasts and their wounded pride. But Catherine Sterling wasn't looking for just any rider. She was looking for a real cowboy, the kind her late husband had been before consumption took him to his grave 3 winters past. The kind who understood that earning a horse's respect was different than breaking its will. The kind who knew that some things in this world couldn't be conquered, only partnered with. So she made her proclamation at the general store on a Tuesday morning when the whole town was listening. If you're a real cowboy, prove it on my stallion. Ride him for 10 minutes without being thrown, and I'll pay you $50 gold. But if you can't, don't come back to my ranch pretending you're something you're not. $50 was more money than most men saw in 6 months. It was enough to buy a decent spread, enough to start a life, enough to make a man think he could take shortcuts to glory. And that's exactly what happened. They came in waves. First the local boys, the ones who'd grown up thinking they knew horses because they'd ridden plow mules to church on Sundays. Then the drifters, leather-faced men with tobacco stains and tall tails who figured they'd seen enough country to handle any 4-legged creature. Finally came the professionals, the rodeo riders and horse trainers who carried their reputation in their swagger and their failure in their limp when they left. Each man who approached Tempest thought he had the answer. Some came with whips, thinking fear would make the stallion submit. Others brought sugar cubes and gentle words, believing they could sweet-talk their way onto his back. A few arrived with elaborate contraptions, ropes and pulleys and leather straps designed to force compliance. But Tempest had his own ideas about compliance. The first man lasted 8 seconds. The stallion reared up like a dark angel reaching for heaven, then twisted sideways with a violence that sent the rider sailing into the corral fence. The second man made it to 15 seconds before Tempest decided he'd had enough and bucked with a precision that would have impressed a mathematician. The third, fourth, and fifth men learned that pride goes before a fall, and sometimes the fall comes with hoof prints. By the end of the first week, the town doctor had treated more bruised ribs and wounded egos than he'd seen since the last cattle drive went sideways. But still they came. Word had spread beyond Dry Creek Valley now. Cowboys rode in from neighboring counties, drawn by the challenge and the gold like moths to a flame that would surely burn them. Catherine Sterling watched it all from her porch, arms folded, expression unreadable as stone. Some folks whispered she was cruel, setting up men to fail for her own amusement. Others said she was testing fate, that no horse was worth the bones being broken in her corral. But Catherine knew something they didn't. She knew her husband had ridden Tempest. Once. The day before he died, when the fever was already burning through him like summer lightning, he'd walked out to that corral, and somehow, that wild stallion had let him climb aboard. For 10 minutes they'd moved together like they were dancing to music only they could hear. Man and horse in perfect harmony, circling the corral with a grace that made watching feel like witnessing something sacred. When her husband finally dismounted, his eyes were bright with more than fever. "That horse knows things, Catherine," he'd whispered. "He's waiting for the right man, someone who understands what it means to be free." Now, 3 years later, she was still looking for that man. The 15th challenger came on a Thursday. He was young, maybe 22, with sun-bleached hair and the kind of confidence that hadn't been tested by enough failures yet. He lasted 12 seconds, which was impressive until Tempest decided to add a little creativity to the dismount. The boy landed face first in the water trough, came up sputtering and cursing, and rode out of town, without looking back. The 20th challenger was different. Older, quieter, with scars on his hands that spoke of real work with real animals. He approached Tempest with patience, spent an hour just standing near the fence, letting the stallion take his measure. When he finally climbed into the corral, there was hope in the air thick as summer humidity. He lasted nearly 4 minutes before Tempest reminded him that patience and partnership were two different things entirely. By the time the 25th man limped away from the Sterling ranch, defeat hanging on him like a wet coat, the whole county was talking. Some said Catherine's challenge was impossible. Others claimed the horse was touched by the devil himself. A few wise old-timers suggested that maybe, just maybe, the right man simply hadn't come along yet, but Catherine Sterling kept waiting, because she'd seen what was possible. She'd watched her husband and that stallion move like two parts of the same soul, and she knew that kind of connection couldn't be forced or bought or beaten into existence. It had to be earned. It had to be real. And somewhere out there, she believed, was a real cowboy who would understand. Miles away, in a line shack that smelled of coffee grounds and old leather, a man named Jake Morrison sat by a dying fire, listening to the wind tell stories through the gaps in the chinked logs. He'd heard the rumors drifting along the cattle trails like tumbleweeds. Stories of a black stallion that couldn't be ridden and a widow's challenge that had broken more men than a hard winter. Jake had been alone for so long that solitude felt like an old friend. He worked the far pastures for the Double Bar Ranch, checking fence lines and doctoring sick cattle, seeing other humans maybe once a month when he rode into town for supplies. It was honest work that paid honest wages, and it suited a man who'd learned that people could hurt you in ways that cattle never would. But something about those stories nagged at him. Not the gold, though $50 would buy a lot of beans and bacon. Not the challenge, though he'd ridden his share of difficult horses. It was something else, something that whispered to him in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, when a man's defenses were down, and truth could slip in like morning light through a cracked shutter. Maybe it was the way the story was told, not as a contest to be won, but as a test to be passed. Not as a horse to be broken, but as a partnership to be forged. Or maybe it was simply that Jake Morrison had been running from something for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to run toward something instead. He'd been a different man once. Before the war changed him. Before he'd seen what men could do to each other when they forgot they were supposed to be human. Before he'd learned that sometimes the only way to survive was to stop caring about anything beyond your next breath. But horses were different. Horses didn't lie or betray, or leave you bleeding in a ditch because they disagreed with your politics. Horses were honest in their fear and their trust, their anger and their affection. A horse would tell you exactly what it thought of you, and if you were smart enough to listen, you might learn something worth knowing. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny prayers seeking heaven. Jake pulled his coat tighter and made a decision that would change everything. Come morning, he would saddle his gelding and ride toward Dry Creek Valley. Not for the money, not for the glory, but because sometimes a man had to find out what he was made of, even if the finding broke him, especially if the finding broke him. Because Jake Morrison suspected that he'd been broken for a long time already, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to see if the pieces could be put back together in a way that made sense. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows like restless spirits demanding attention. Inside the line shack, a lonely cowboy closed his eyes and dreamed of black stallions and second chances, unaware that tomorrow would begin the ride that would define the rest of his life. The morning came cold and sharp as broken glass. Jake Morrison saddled his gelding in the gray light before dawn, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind wrestled with doubts that multiplied like shadows. He'd packed light, just coffee and hardtack, a bedroll tied behind the cantle, and the kind of quiet determination that came from a man who'd finally stopped running from his own reflection. The ride to Dry Creek Valley took him through country that changed with every mile. Rolling grassland gave way to broken mesa, then dropped into valleys where cottonwoods hugged seasonal creeks like old friends sharing secrets. His gelding, a steady bay named Copper, picked his way along cattle trails and deer paths with the sure-footed wisdom of an animal that had seen enough rough country to know which stones would hold and which would roll. By midday, the sun had burned off the morning chill, and Jake could see the valley spreading out below him like a promised land that might deliver salvation or damnation, depending on what a man brought to the bargain. Smoke rose from chimney pipes in the distance, and he could make out the geometric patterns of fenced pastures carved into the natural curves of the landscape. But it was the sound that reached him first, a sound like thunder contained in too small a space, like fury given flesh and hooves. Even from half a mile away, Jake could hear Tempest's challenge echoing off the valley walls, a declaration that said more about wildness and freedom than any poem ever written. Copper's ears pricked forward, and Jake felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Not excitement exactly, but recognition, like calling to like across the distance between what was and what might be. The Sterling Ranch sat in a natural bowl of land where spring water gathered and grass grew thick even in dry years. It was the kind of spread that spoke of careful planning and harder work, where every fence post had been set with purpose, and every building placed to catch the morning sun while blocking the worst of the winter wind. But Jake's eyes went straight to the corral, where a crowd had gathered like spectators at a hanging. Another challenger had arrived ahead of him. Jake dismounted at the edge of the crowd and led Copper to a hitching post near the barn. The men gathered around the corral were the usual mix you'd find at any spectacle in cattle country. Cowboys from local spreads, townsmen with soft hands and hard opinions, drifters who followed excitement like dogs following bacon scraps. They were all watching a man in fancy chaps and silver spurs approach the black stallion with the kind of swagger that announced he'd never met a horse he couldn't handle. Tempest stood in the center of the corral like a storm made flesh. His coat was black as midnight water, so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His neck arched with the pride of something that had never bowed to any man's will, and when he moved, it was with the fluid power of controlled lightning. This wasn't just a horse, Jake realized. This was something closer to a force of nature that happened to have 4 legs and a heartbeat. The challenger approached with a rope in one hand and confidence dripping from him like summer sweat. He'd clearly done this before, knew all the tricks, had the kind of reputation that preceded him like dust before a storm. The crowd murmured approval as he began working the rope, building a loop with practiced ease. But Tempest had seen ropes before. When the loop settled over his neck, the stallion's reaction was immediate and devastating. He reared up on his hind legs, front hooves pawing the air like he was trying to claw his way to heaven, then came down with a force that shook the ground. The rope went slack as he spun sideways, using momentum and geometry to create an opening that the challenger never saw coming. The man hit the dirt hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs and the arrogance from his posture. He rolled away from the stallion's hooves, came up gasping and dusty, and for a moment Jake thought he might be smart enough to stay down. But pride makes fools of better men than this one, and he grabbed for the rope again. Tempest's patience had limits, and this challenger had just found them. What followed wasn't pretty. The stallion didn't just buck, he orchestrated a symphony of controlled violence that spoke to years of dealing with men who thought they could take by force what could only be given freely. He twisted and turned, reared and spun, using every trick that evolution and experience had taught him about removing unwanted passengers from his back. The challenger lasted maybe 30 seconds before Tempest decided the conversation was over. A final, decisive buck sent the man flying toward the fence with enough force to rattle the rails. He landed in a heap of expensive leather and wounded pride, then crawled toward the fence like a man trying to remember which end was up. The crowd was already dispersing, muttering among themselves about impossible horses and foolish challenges, when Jake finally saw her clearly for the first time. Catherine Sterling stood on the ranch house porch like she was holding court with the sky itself. She wasn't beautiful in the way that stopped conversations in saloons, but there was something about her that made you forget to look away. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, pulled back in a way that framed a face that had learned to weather storms without breaking. Her dress was practical rather than pretty, but it fit her the way good leather fits a working man's hands, shaped by purpose and strengthened by use. But it was her eyes that held Jake's attention. They were the color of winter sky, gray with hints of blue that suggested depths you might never reach bottom of. They were the eyes of someone who had loved deeply and lost completely, who had been broken and rebuilt herself stronger than before. They were eyes that had seen through 25 men's pretenses and found them wanting. Now those eyes were looking at Jake with the kind of assessment that could weigh a man's soul and find it either worthy or lacking in the space of a heartbeat. He felt exposed under that gaze, like she could see past all his carefully constructed defenses to the scared, hollow man he'd been trying to hide from for so long. "Are you here to try your luck with my horse?" She called down from the porch, her voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. Jake touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that came from somewhere deeper than manners. "Thinking about it, ma'am." She studied him for a long moment, taking in his worn but well-maintained gear. The way he moved around horses like he belonged in their world, the quiet confidence that came from years of honest work, rather than empty boasting. "What makes you different from the others?" It was a fair question, and Jake found himself considering it seriously rather than reaching for the easy answer. What did make him different? He wasn't stronger than some of the men who'd tried. He certainly wasn't richer or better connected. He didn't have a reputation that preceded him or skills that set him apart from every other cowboy who'd learned his trade on the back of difficult horses. But maybe that was the answer. "Can't say that I am different, ma'am," he said finally. "But I'm not here to prove anything to anybody. Not to you, not to that crowd, not even to myself. I'm just here to see if that horse and I might find some common ground." Something shifted in Catherine Sterling's expression, a softening around the edges that suggested his words had found their mark. She came down from the porch with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to move efficiently through a world that didn't waste motion, and Jake caught the scent of lavender soap and honest work as she approached. "What's your name, cowboy?" "Jake Morrison, ma'am. I work the line shacks for the Double Bar, up north of here." "Catherine Sterling." She extended her hand, and when Jake took it he was surprised by the strength in her grip, the calluses that spoke of real work with real consequences. "You ever been married, Jake Morrison?" The question caught him off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it cut straight to something he'd been avoiding for years. "No, ma'am. Came close once, before the war. After that..." He let the words trail off, hoping she'd understand what he couldn't quite say. She nodded like she'd expected that answer. "My husband could ride that horse, only man who ever could." "You know why?" Jake studied Tempest, still pacing the corral with the restless energy of caged lightning. "I'd guess it's because he didn't try to break him." "That's part of it." Catherine's voice carried a note of approval. "But there's more." He understood that some things in this world are worth partnering with rather than owning. That real strength comes from knowing when to yield and when to stand firm. That earning trust is different than demanding obedience. She was talking about more than horses now, Jake realized. She was talking about the kind of man her husband had been, the kind of man she was looking for, the kind of man who might understand that some challenges weren't meant to be conquered but transcended. "The rules are simple," Catherine continued. "Stay on his back for 10 minutes without being thrown, and you win the $50. But if you get thrown, you leave and don't come back. And Jake Morrison?" "Yes, ma'am. Don't try this unless you're sure. Because once you step into that corral, there's no going back to who you were before." Jake looked at the corral, then back at Catherine Sterling, and felt something settle into place inside his chest, like a key finding its lock. "Ma'am, I haven't been sure about much of anything for a long time, but I'm sure about this." She studied his face for another moment, then nodded once. "Then you better get acquainted with him first. Most men just climb over that fence like they're mounting a Sunday horse. Tempest doesn't appreciate that kind of presumption." Jake approached the corral slowly, his boots making soft sounds in the packed earth. The few remaining spectators had gathered closer now, sensing that this cowboy might be different from the parade of failures they'd witnessed. But Jake barely noticed them. His attention was fixed on the stallion that stood watching him with eyes like black diamonds, intelligent and calculating and utterly without fear. "Easy there, partner," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying no further than the horse's ears. He didn't climb the fence. Instead, he leaned against the rails and simply waited, letting Tempest take his measure the same way he was taking the stallion's. Tempest approached with the cautious curiosity of something wild that had learned to expect the worst from humans, but hadn't quite given up hope of finding better. He came within 10 feet of the fence and stopped, nostrils flaring as he caught Jake's scent. The stallion's ears moved forward and back, reading signals that most men never learn to send. "You've had your fill of fools, haven't you?" Jake murmured. "Men who think they can take what you never offered to give. But that's not what this is about, is it?" Tempest took another step closer, then another. Jake remained perfectly still, not reaching out, not making demands, just being present in the way that horses understood better than words. Time stretched like taffy in summer heat, measured not in minutes but in heartbeats and the subtle shift of muscle beneath midnight hide. "My husband used to talk to him just like that," Catherine said softly from behind Jake. Said horses could hear the truth in a man's voice, even when the man himself had forgotten what truth sounded like. Jake turned his head slightly but kept his eyes on Tempest. "What did your husband do?" "Before the consumption took him, he was a horsebreaker, the best in 3 counties. But he never broke anything, if you understand my meaning. He had a way of showing horses what they could become instead of forcing them to be something they weren't." Her voice carried the weight of memory and loss. "He said the best horses, the ones worth having, they choose their riders as much as riders choose them." Tempest had moved closer now, close enough that Jake could see the scars along his neck and shoulders, evidence of previous encounters with men who'd tried to take by force what could only be earned through understanding. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, and something else. Recognition, maybe. Or possibility. "He's been waiting," Jake said, not really speaking to Catherine, but not exactly talking to himself either. 3 years, she confirmed. 3 years of men thinking they could master him with whips or bribes or fancy gear. 3 years of him teaching them the difference between submission and partnership. Jake finally moved, just his hand, extending it palm up toward the fence rail. Tempest's ears flicked forward, and after a moment that felt like forever. The stallion stepped close enough to blow warm breath across Jake's fingers. Not quite touching, but close enough to establish that communication was possible. "You ready for this?" Catherine asked. Jake looked at her over his shoulder, seeing something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Hope, maybe. Or the kind of cautious optimism that comes from watching too many dreams die, but not quite being ready to give up on dreaming. "Ma'am, I've been ready for something like this my whole life. I just never knew what it was until right now." He climbed the fence then, moving slowly and deliberately, giving Tempest every opportunity to object or retreat. But the stallion held his ground, watching with the intensity of something that had learned to read men's souls through their actions rather than their words. The corral felt different from inside, bigger somehow, but also more intimate. It was just Jake and Tempest now, with Catherine and the remaining spectators fading into background noise like distant thunder. The stallion moved with liquid grace, circling Jake at a distance that suggested interest without commitment, evaluation without verdict. "You know what they say about you," Jake said conversationally, matching Tempest's movement with his own, staying centered but not confrontational. "They say you're unrideable, that you've got the devil in you, that you're too proud and too wild and too stubborn for any man to handle." Tempest snorted, a sound that might have been amusement or disdain or simple acknowledgement of the truth. "But I don't think that's it at all," Jake continued, his voice steady and low. "I think you're just tired of men who want to own you instead of know you. Tired of being treated like a problem to be solved instead of a partner to be earned." The stallion's ears pricked forward. and he slowed his circling pace. Not stopping, not yet, but considering. See, the thing is, I'm not here to break you or tame you or make you into something you're not. Jake stopped moving and let Tempest continue his circle. I'm here because I think maybe we've both been carrying something heavy for too long, and maybe, just maybe, we can help each other figure out how to set it down. Tempest completed another circle, then another, each one bringing him incrementally closer to where Jake stood in the center of the corral. The afternoon sun caught the highlights in his black coat, revealing depths of color that spoke to bloodlines and breeding and something indefinable that separated the extraordinary from the merely good. My husband said something once, Catherine called from the fence, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. He said the best horses don't need to be broken because they were never really wild to begin with. They were just waiting for someone who could speak their language. Jake nodded without taking his eyes off Tempest. The stallion had stopped circling now and stood perhaps 15 feet away, head high, ears forward, every line of his body speaking to attention and possibility. This was the moment, Jake realized. The moment when everything would be decided not by force or cleverness or determination, but by something much more elusive and infinitely more valuable. Trust. You want to know the truth? Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the corral. I'm scared. Not of you, but of what happens if this doesn't work. Because I've been empty for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to want something real. And you're about as real as anything gets. Tempest took a step forward, then another. His movement was deliberate, considered, the decision of something that had weighed all the evidence and reached a verdict that surprised even him. That's it, Jake breathed. That's the way. No rush, no pressure, just two souls figuring out if they can find some common ground in a world that's forgotten how to be gentle. The stallion approached until he was close enough to touch. Close enough that Jake could see his own reflection in those dark eyes. For a long moment they simply stood there, man and horse, each taking the measure of the other in ways that had nothing to do with strength or skill or reputation. Then, moving with the slow certainty of sunrise, Jake reached out and laid his palm against Tempest's neck. The stallion didn't flinch, didn't step away, didn't rear or strike or demonstrate any of the violent rejections that had become his signature response to human contact. Instead, he leaned into the touch, just slightly. Just enough to say that perhaps, after all this time, after all these failed attempts, after all the pain and disappointment and broken trust, maybe it was time to try again. Maybe it was time to remember what partnership looked like. The crowd at the fence had gone completely silent. Even Catherine Sterling seemed to be holding her breath as Jake slowly, carefully began to run his hand along Tempest's neck and shoulder, mapping the contours of muscle and bone, learning the language of this magnificent creature who had waited so long for someone who could speak it fluently. Well, I'll be damned, someone whispered from the fence, but Jake barely heard it. His world had narrowed to this moment, this horse, this possibility that hung between them like morning mist, fragile and beautiful and full of promise. You ready? Jake asked, though the question was meant more for himself than for Tempest. The stallion's response came not in words, but in the subtle shift of weight, the way his muscles relaxed just enough to suggest acceptance without surrender. Jake moved to Tempest's left side, his hand never leaving contact with the horse's coat. Each movement was deliberate, telegraphed well in advance, giving the stallion every opportunity to object or withdraw consent. But Tempest held steady, his breathing deep and even, his attention focused on this strange man who spoke in whispers instead of shouts, who asked instead of demanded. The mounting process took nearly 10 minutes. Not because Jake was afraid, but because he understood that this wasn't about climbing onto a horse. This was about joining something, becoming part of a partnership that had to be built one heartbeat at a time. He gathered the makeshift reins, nothing more than a rope halter, and placed his left foot in the stirrup he'd fashioned from a length of braided leather. Tempest's ears flicked back, then forward again. Listening, considering. The stallion could have exploded into motion at any point. could have sent Jake flying before he'd even settled into the saddle. Instead, he waited with the patience of something that had finally found what it had been looking for. When Jake's weight settled across Tempest's back, the world seemed to hold its breath. The stallion stood motionless for a heartbeat, 2, 3. Then, with a movement so smooth it felt like floating, Tempest took a single step forward. Sweet Mother of God, someone breathed from the fence, but their voice seemed to come from another world entirely. Jake's universe had contracted to the space between Tempest's ears, to the rhythm of hooves against packed earth, to the feeling of controlled power moving beneath him like captured lightning learning to dance. They walked first, just a slow circuit of the corral, both horse and rider finding their balance together. Tempest's gait was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. It wasn't the jarring bounce of a green horse or the mechanical precision of a well-trained mount. This was something organic, fluid, like being carried by the wind itself. "How long has it been?" Catherine called from the fence, her voice tight with something that might have been wonder or fear, or both. Jake glanced toward the sun, trying to judge the passage of time, but realized it didn't matter. Minutes or hours, he was lost in this moment, in the feeling of partnership with something wild and magnificent and utterly without pretense. Tempest moved beneath him with growing confidence, their connection deepening with each stride. Then the stallion made his decision. Without warning, without any of the preliminary theatrics that usually announced a horse's intention to test its rider, Tempest launched into a trot. Not the jarring, bone-rattling gait that most horses produced, but something smoother, more purposeful. Jake felt the change in rhythm, the shift from walking meditation to something approaching flight, and instead of fighting it, he went with it. "That's it," he whispered, his voice lost in the wind they were creating. "Show me what you can do." Tempest's response was immediate and breathtaking. He shifted into a canter that felt like riding a storm cloud, each stride covering ground with the efficiency of something born to run. The corral fence flashed past them in a blur of wood and wire, and Jake caught glimpses of faces pressed against the rails, mouths open in amazement. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the conversation happening between his body and Tempest's, the wordless communication that flowed between them like electricity through copper wire. When Jake shifted his weight slightly to the left, Tempest banked into the turn with the precision of a hawk riding thermals. When Jake relaxed his grip on the reins, the stallion responded by extending his stride, reaching for distance and speed with the joy of something finally allowed to be what it was meant to be. They were no longer rider and horse. They were something new, something that had never existed before this moment and might never exist again. They were partnership made manifest, trust given form, the answer to a question that neither had known how to ask until they found each other. The minutes stretched and flowed like honey in sunlight. Jake lost track of everything except the rhythm beneath him, the feeling of Tempest's breathing synchronized with his own, the way the stallion's ears stayed pricked forward in an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. This wasn't about dominance or submission, breaking or being broken. This was about two souls recognizing something familiar in each other and choosing to move forward together. 10 minutes. Catherine's voice cut through the sound of hooves and wind, but she might as well have been speaking from another planet. Jake heard her words without comprehending their meaning, too lost in the conversation he was having with Tempest to remember that this had started as a challenge with rules and time limits and monetary prizes. But Tempest remembered. The stallion began to slow, not from exhaustion or reluctance, but with the deliberate control of something that understood the difference between freedom and chaos. He brought them down from canter to trot, to walk with the same fluid grace that had marked their entire ride, finally coming to rest in the center of the corral where they had begun. The silence that followed was profound. Jake could hear his own heartbeat, could feel Tempest's breathing gradually returning to normal beneath him, could sense the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes watching from the fence. But none of that seemed real. What was real was the warmth of the horse between his legs, The trust that had been offered and accepted. The knowledge that something fundamental had changed in both of them. "I'll be damned," someone finally whispered from the crowd, and the words seemed to break whatever spell had held the moment suspended outside of time. Jake dismounted slowly, his legs unsteady not from fear, but from the after effects of experiencing something transcendent. Tempest turned his head to watch Jake's descent, and for a moment their eyes met in a look that contained volumes of unspoken understanding. 15 minutes, Catherine said, her voice carrying clearly across the corral. "You rode him for 15 minutes. Jake looked at her in confusion, still too dazed by what had just happened to fully process her words. "The challenge was 10 minutes, Mom. I figured—" "The challenge was 10 minutes without being thrown," she interrupted, stepping through the gate into the corral. "You weren't thrown. You could have ridden him all afternoon if you'd wanted to." She approached Tempest with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance, running her hand along his neck in a gesture that was part congratulation, part relief, part something deeper that Jake couldn't quite identify. The stallion whickered softly at her touch, a sound of contentment that Jake had never heard him make before. "He remembers," Catherine said softly, her hand still stroking Tempest's neck. "He remembers what it feels like to carry someone who understands." Jake watched the interaction between woman and horse, seeing in it echoes of the partnership he had just experienced. There was history here, layers of meaning that went deeper than any simple transaction or challenge. Catherine Sterling wasn't just offering $50 to anyone who could ride her horse. She was looking for something specific, something that had been lost and might never be found again. "Your husband," Jake said quietly. "He rode like that?" Catherine's smile was soft and sad and beautiful all at once. "He rode exactly like that, like he was born to it, like Tempest was born to carry him." She looked at Jake with eyes that held depths he was only beginning to understand. "I haven't seen anything like it since the day he died." The crowd at the fence was beginning to disperse now, the spectacle over, the impossible made routine by the simple fact of its accomplishment. But Jake barely noticed their departure. His attention was fixed on Catherine, on the way she looked at him with something that might have been recognition or gratitude, or the first stirrings of something neither of them was ready to name. "The money," she said, reaching into the pocket of her dress. $50, as promised. Jake looked at the gold coins in her palm, then back at her face. The money seemed suddenly irrelevant, a detail from a different world where such things mattered. "Keep it," he said. This wasn't about the money. Catherine's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Then what was it about?" Jake looked at Tempest, who stood between them like a bridge connecting two souls who had been walking parallel paths without knowing it. "I think it was about finding something I didn't know I was looking for." "And what was that?" He met her eyes, seeing in them the same recognition he felt stirring in his own chest. Home, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. Catherine Sterling had been alone for 3 years. 3 years of managing a ranch by herself, of making decisions that affected not just her own future but the future of every animal in her care. 3 years of well-meaning neighbors offering advice she didn't need, and suitors offering protection she didn't want. 3 years of proving to herself and everyone else that she could survive without a man's help. But surviving wasn't the same as living, and watching Jake Morrison ride her husband's horse had reminded her of the difference. "You have somewhere you need to be?" she asked, the question casual but weighted with possibility. Jake looked around the ranch, taking in the well-maintained buildings, the carefully tended pastures, the sense of order and purpose that spoke to someone who understood what it meant to build something lasting. Then he looked back at Catherine, seeing in her face the same quiet strength he'd felt in Tempest, the same patient endurance that came from weathering storms without breaking. "No, ma'am," he said finally. "Can't say that I do. The Double Bar Ranch, they'll miss you." Jake thought about his line shack, about the solitude that had been both refuge and prison for longer than he cared to remember, about cattle that needed tending and fences that needed mending and the endless cycle of work that filled days without filling the emptiness inside them. "They'll find someone else," he said. Always do. Catherine nodded, as if his answer was exactly what she'd expected. I could use help around here. Running a spread this size alone, it's more than one person should handle. The pay's fair, and there's a cabin out by the north pasture that needs someone living in it. She paused, studying his face as if trying to read his thoughts written there. Course, there's one condition. What's that? Tempest comes with the job. He needs someone who understands him, someone who can work with him instead of against him. Think you might be interested in that kind of partnership? Jake looked at the stallion, who had moved closer during their conversation and now stood with his head lowered, breath warm against Jake's shoulder. The horse's presence felt like an anchor, something solid and real in a world that had been shifting beneath his feet for longer than he cared to remember. Yes, ma'am, he said, his voice steady with the kind of certainty he hadn't felt in years. I believe I might be very interested in that. Catherine's smile was like sunrise after a long night, warm and bright, and full of promise. Then welcome to the Sterling Ranch, Jake Morrison. I have a feeling this is going to be the beginning of something good. As if in agreement, Tempest lifted his head and whinnied once, a sound that echoed across the valley like a declaration of new beginnings. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched the hope stirring in Jake's chest. He had come here looking for a challenge and found something infinitely more valuable. He had found a place where his skills were needed, his presence welcomed, his future suddenly bright with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. But most importantly, he had found what every real cowboy spent his life searching for, whether he knew it or not. He had found home. The seasons turned like pages in a well-worn book, each one marking changes that went deeper than weather or work routines. By the time spring returned to Dry Creek Valley, Jake Morrison had become as much a part of the Sterling Ranch as the cottonwoods by the creek or the morning mist that clung to the pastures like a gentle blessing. He had moved into the cabin by the north pasture, a sturdy structure that had sat empty too long but welcomed him like it had been waiting. The windows faced east toward the sunrise, and from his porch he could see Tempest grazing in the far meadow, the stallion's black coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the early light. The work suited him in ways he hadn't expected. Not just the familiar rhythm of ranch life, the mending and building and tending that filled his days with purpose, but the partnership that had grown between him and the horse that had changed everything. Tempest had become more than a mount, more than a working animal. He had become a translator of Jake's intentions, carrying him across the range with the understanding that comes from shared experience and mutual respect. Catherine had watched this partnership develop with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had planted seeds in good soil and seen them flourish beyond her wildest hopes. She had also watched Jake himself change, seen the hollow look leave his eyes, witnessed the gradual return of something that might have been joy if it hadn't been buried so deep for so long. But it was the moments between work that spoke loudest about what was growing between them. The shared cups of coffee on her porch when the evening chores were done. The conversations that started about cattle and weather and ended up touching on dreams and losses and the careful hope that maybe, just maybe, the future could be different from the past. You know, Catherine said one evening as they sat watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of copper and gold, I never thanked you properly. Jake looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup, puzzled. For what? For proving me right, she smiled, the expression soft and genuine. For 3 years I insisted that Tempest wasn't unrideable, just misunderstood, that he was waiting for the right man, someone who could see past his reputation to what he really was. Most folks thought I was fooling myself, holding on to something that couldn't be held. And now they see what I always knew was possible. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the pasture where Tempest stood silhouetted against the evening sky. Sometimes the most worthwhile things in life are the ones you have to wait for. There was something in her voice, a weight behind the words that suggested she wasn't talking only about horses. Jake felt his heart skip a beat, recognizing the moment for what it was, the careful opening of a door that had been locked for too long. Catherine, he said quietly, setting down his cup and turning to face her fully. "I need you to know something." She met his eyes, steady and patient, giving him the space to find the words he'd been carrying inside him like a burden too heavy to bear alone. "I came here thinking I was just a man looking to prove himself on a difficult horse. But what I found..." He paused, searching for words adequate to the enormity of what he felt. "What I found was a place where I could remember who I used to be. Before the war, before all the running and hiding and trying to outrun the ghosts that followed me home." Catherine reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand in hers, her touch warm and steady and utterly without hesitation. "You found yourself," she said simply. "Same as Tempest found himself when you showed him what partnership could look like, instead of domination. I found more than that." Jake's voice was rough with emotion he'd kept locked away for years. "I found you." The kiss that followed was inevitable as sunrise, gentle as spring rain, and full of the promise that some things lost could be found again, that some broken places could heal stronger than they'd ever been before. When they finally broke apart, the stars had begun to appear overhead, and somewhere in the distance, Tempest called out once, a sound that seemed to bless what was beginning between them. "Marry me," Jake said, the words coming from somewhere deeper than thought or planning. "I know it's sudden. I know I don't have much to offer except a cowboy's wages and a heart that's finally remembered how to hope, but..." Catherine silenced him with another kiss, this one fierce and joyful and full of the certainty that comes from recognizing something you've been waiting for without knowing its name. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, Jake Morrison. Yes to all of it." The wedding took place 6 months later, on a October morning when the cottonwoods had turned gold and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. It was a simple ceremony, held in the ranch house parlor with a handful of neighbors as witnesses and a preacher who had ridden out from town specifically for the occasion. Catherine wore her mother's dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit, the ivory silk complemented by a strand of pearls that had been her grandmother's. Jake had bought a new shirt for the occasion, pressed his best pants, and polished his boots until they reflected the morning light streaming through the windows. But it was Tempest who provided the most memorable moment of the ceremony. As Jake and Catherine spoke their vows on the front porch, the Stallion approached the fence and stood watching, his magnificent head held high, his presence somehow sanctifying what was taking place. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Tempest reared up on his hind legs once, a joyful celebration that made everyone laugh and Catherine cry happy tears into her new husband's shoulder. The years that followed were marked not by dramatic events but by the quiet accumulation of contentment. Jake proved to be not just a skilled ranch hand but a natural leader, gradually taking over more and more of the daily operations as Catherine's trust in his judgment grew. Together they expanded the Sterling Ranch, adding new pastures and breeding programs, building a reputation for quality horses that spread far beyond Dry Creek Valley. Tempest became the foundation stallion of their breeding program, his offspring inheriting not just his speed and strength, but his intelligence and his ability to form deep bonds with the right humans. Jake trained each of them personally, using the same patience and understanding that had won Tempest's trust, creating a line of horses known throughout the territory for their responsiveness and heart. But perhaps the greatest testament to what they had built together came 5 years after their wedding, when a young cowboy rode into the yard leading a limping horse and carrying the weight of visible desperation in his shoulders. "Name's Tom Bradley," the young man said, his hat in his hands and hope flickering in his eyes. "I heard tell you folks might have work for someone who's better with horses than he is with people." Jake and Catherine exchanged a look that carried 5 years of shared understanding, remembering another lost cowboy who had ridden into their lives, carrying his own ghosts and searching for something he couldn't name. "Well, Tom Bradley," Catherine said with a smile that held all the warmth of hard-won wisdom, "I think we might just have exactly what you're looking for." And as the sun set over Dry Creek Valley that evening, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Jake Morrison stood on his porch with his wife beside him and watched a new story beginning. Somewhere in the pasture, Tempest lifted his head and called out once, a sound that seemed to say that some challenges weren't meant to break a man, but to remake him, and that sometimes the most beautiful things in life came to those who were brave enough to prove themselves worthy of them. In the Wild West, they said, only the strong survived. But Jake Morrison had learned a different truth, one written in the language of trust and partnership and love that endured. Sometimes it wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest or the most fearless. Sometimes it was simply about being real.